Welcome to the You Need a Training podcast, hosted by Heart and Solutions, a strength-based counseling agency. We know that the life of a mental health professional can be busy, and finding time to complete those continuing education credit hours can be a challenge. With that in mind, this show is focused on helping mental health providers easily access continuing education credits on a variety of topics. The best part? These trainings, many of which will provide at least 1 credit hour, can be completed anywhere you listen to your podcasts. Traveling to and from work? Great. Taking a walk? Excellent. Enjoying a quiet moment on the couch? Perfect. No matter where you are, get ready for engaging, thought-provoking conversations that double as CE hours, because we all know you need a training.
Hello, welcome to episode 3 of our You Need a Training podcast. For those that are still just getting to know us, I am Dr. Colleen Grote, the Vice President of Therapy at Heart and Solutions. I have a PhD in counselor education and supervision. I'm a licensed mental health counselor in Iowa and a registered play therapy supervisor. Today, I'm joined by the president and owner of Heart and Solutions, Julie Johnson.
Hello.
As well as today's guest, Marisa Mansfield. And Julie's going to introduce our incredible guest today.
Okay, we are so excited to have Marisa with us here. Marisa joins us from Davenport, Iowa in the Quad Cities. She has an extensive background. She's been in the social services field for 15 years. She has a master's in social work, and she works with children at the Monroe Elementary School in Davenport, but she also works with adults in her private practice at Blue Tree Counseling. She's one of the owners over there, and she works with adults on PTSD treatment, substance abuse, domestic violence treatment services, sexual assault, ADHD, anxiety and depression. She also utilizes these techniques with those children that she works with, as well as adults. She is able to provide Adlerian Play Therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy as well. And most exciting of all for this audience, she is in those final phases, and most listeners are well aware of those final phases of becoming a RPT, a registered play therapist. So very, very exciting to have her here. Welcome, Marisa, and thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you guys so very much for having me on and inviting me to present. I am very excited to talk to you guys and your audience about Sandtray and some directives with grief and loss. So let's go ahead and get started. As Julie said, I am Marisa Mansfield, and I'm from the Quad City area. I've been practicing here a very long time. And she went ahead and gave you all of my credentials, so I won't go through that again. But I will say I have loved every single minute of it. And I truly feel like I've found my calling when it comes to working with children and families. It is something that I take great pride in and I enjoy immensely. I have been going through the process of getting my RPT, my registered play therapy, and through that process, they make sure that you know what you're doing, and they want you to take all of the trainings and all of the things. So that has been a really extensive but unique process for me to learn some additional skills that I can implement in my practice. So moving forward with that, I have been working primarily in a school-based setting. I have a caseload of about 20 to 30 students. Something that was unique, I would say, in this year was that the school that I was working at the time found out through the Davenport School District that they unfortunately were going to be closing that school. And what is important to understand about the students at Monroe Elementary School is not only did, all of the students throughout the United States particularly, but they had just survived, all of the changes that happened with COVID, all of the disruptions in schedules and routines. But this community that this school serves is a lower socioeconomic class. There are lots of transient families through that school. And the school is really kind of the heart of their neighborhood and their community. It has a food pantry twice a month, clothing closet, snack programs. It provides and meets a lot of our families' needs. So to find out that our school was set to close was going to be a really significant loss for these kids and for the teachers alike. So what we were having, unfortunately, happen is a spike in behaviors. And really, it was the adults in the building were unfortunately very dysregulated because they had a lot of unknowns coming their way, which was not necessarily helpful to our students, but understandably so. Everyone was kind of in this weird flux period, right? So through COVID, I had kind of switched my focus and my practice to doing lots of non-directive work. So what I was seeing happen is, the anger issues that we were really focusing on prior to COVID, let's say, that was really going to have to take a back seat because these kids that were presenting in my office were dealing with a lot of grief and loss symptoms because they were missing maybe family members that were high risk and they couldn't see face to face, or they were missing friends that they went to school with, but they were on an adjusted schedule because of COVID scheduling. So I started doing lots of non-directive work. So for context, I was probably in like my phase 2 of my RPT, or early phase 2. And I had not done like specific Sandtray training up until this point. So I, was feeling it out, experimenting with some other non-directive pieces of play therapy, but really was kind of lost. And what I was understanding after taking a training that was based on Holmeyer's book and, kind of those foundations, was that what I was doing prior was really SAM play. So once we found out the school was closing, and we were seeing all this escalation in behaviors and these kids just hurting so badly. What I did is, again, these kids were expressing a need. So I went back to doing my non-directive stuff when it came to play therapy. But I had the idea, and now I had some training under my belt when it came specifically to Sandtray, of how to really incorporate something a little bit more directive when it came to helping process their grief and loss. Because, a lot of the kids didn't recognize necessarily that that's why they were hurting so severely. But all the adults knew, all the parents knew, but they weren't really able.
Like that. Yeah, it sounds like that training that you took and getting some recognition of Sandtray work, right? Really came at a great time, right? Despite the unfortunate circumstances of all of that transition, recognizing that grief and loss is so much more than how we traditionally maybe think about grief, right? And we often think about it as solely relating to, the death or loss of a loved one, and really recognizing that grief and loss can be associated with so many forms of transition and that hurt that they were experiencing. And I'm really excited to see, what you were able to incorporate with that.
Yeah. So thank you for bringing that up. Yeah. So, we often do take it as, death of a loved one or death of a pet, but it is so much more extensive in terms of grief. COVID, that was a huge loss for kids because they couldn't see people that they wanted to. They were losing their routines, and all of that disruption really triggers those same feelings. and we have those same responses. So we know that grief is a very natural response to loss. We understand that as therapists. So now it's just carrying that same feeling over to all of these different circumstances. So loss of a job for adults, moving in, children and families, losing any sort of parental figure caretaker, with placements in foster care or family placements due to, risks of abuse. So all of those losses will automatically exhibit like a grief response in individuals. So yes, all of this kind of came together. And I was able to kind of pull from that training. And obviously, I also want to point out that there are people that have extensive backgrounds in Sandtray. So I still consider myself a novice, right? I've had training, I've had supervision with using Sandtray, but I'm still very much a novice because there are, organizations that and I think actually even additional certifications that you can get within Sandtray. But these are all very easy things to kind of implement because we're already doing the work, and you already have, as that therapist, such amazing insight into these kids and understanding what it is that they need in order to heal.
I just wanted to say that I think it's so amazing that when this change happened, when the school that in essence served as a community center was closed, that you being a part of that school, you were able to recognize that this is a huge loss for the teachers and the students and everybody involved, and being able to say, okay, this overrides the other goals and treatments that we were doing at that time. I also noticed that you used the word sand play versus Sandtray. And I just thought that was so interesting, and the personal insight or professional insight to be able to say, yeah, I was doing a lot of sand play, and not that that wasn't helpful to the students that I was working with, but now that I understand Sandtray, I'm using those directive approaches even more intentionally in my work with grief and loss. So I'd love to hear kind of your definitions of what does it mean to be doing sand play, and what does it mean to be doing Sandtray, and how can we know the difference?
Absolutely. Thank you. So I would classify SAM play, and there is definitely still clinical benefits and all of that. Just the tactile sensory regulation of incorporating sand into play. So SAM play is when you have, think of your littles on your caseload, your very little early elementary kids, and they are taking the toys, and it is an active, constantly moving, fluid scene, right? They are using the sand in the element of their play, right? There are, again, benefits to using the sand in that manner. Incredibly regulating. We know that littles really enjoy sensory play, and it just gives one more medium, right, for processing. Well, in Sandtray, this is more successful, I would say, in my experience, more successful with your older elementary school children. I think Homeyer puts the age of 8, probably loosely on that, but just developmentally, where are they at? About around age 8 is where they can actually conceptualize, like, okay, this is going to be a stationary thing. And the way I kind of explain it to my kiddos, one of the directives that I'm giving them as I'm introducing Sandtray to them is that, so what I'm asking you to do is I have all of these things that you can use to make an image in the sand And the edge of the sand tray is going to be like your frame, and it's going to stay put. And we will then walk away from it. And then if you want and feel comfortable with that, we can talk about that. So it kind of gives the idea that they are using the miniatures or the objects or the toys that the play therapist is set out to create a stationary image in the sand to allow for processing, if that's what the clinician feels is appropriate later.
It's a video when we're doing sand play. It's more of a moving video. And then when we're doing Sandtray, it's a photograph. It's a snapshot in time.
Yes, I love that. Yes, absolutely. And don't get me wrong, there are kids who have made adjustments, like when we are maybe talking about the Sandtray later, they're like, oh, wait, I really want that here. And then they'll make, an adjustment. And, that's obviously totally fine. But that otherwise they are generally stationary. Yes. Yeah.
And in that sense, it's almost like, you take a picture of your child and they've got short hair, and then you take a picture for back to school and they've got that longer hair, right? And you can kind of compare the differences between, this is the tray you made, this is the snapshot you had, and then you made these adjustments, and now here's the snapshot that you had.
Yes. And then to reflect after the session, with yourself as a clinician, I wonder why that change occurred. And then if you feel like it's appropriate, bring that to light with your client later. Absolutely. Let's see. Oh, and I mentioned the miniatures and toys and stuff that objects. There are some really nature-based, I'll call them, play therapists or Sandtray therapists who do these really exquisite sand trays with all nature-based things. So therapists are the most creative, lovely people I know. And they take such pride if they do Sandtray and their Sandtray miniatures and all the objects that they use. It's so exciting and fascinating to see what some of our colleagues come up with. Some of them are really creative and symbolic with the intention that they put into selecting some of their miniatures. Others are more literal, right? And it kind of also goes to speak to your client base. So in particular, I want to mention how it is very important for the clinician who is selecting the Sandtray miniatures to incorporate items that are culturally significant to the population that they are working with. And also, when it comes to grief and loss, have some more maybe symbolic things, because rainbows speak differently to people than, your crosses and your coffins. So it really is important for a Sandtray therapist or a play therapist to have a wide variety of selection, because we don't know. I mean, hopefully you would know by the point that you're doing a Sandtray work with your client, but you not always are going to know if there's any aversion or trauma associated with any other grief and loss objects that you might contain in your collection of miniatures. So having a wide variety is really important.
I really love that you highlight that, Marisa. One of the things that I talk to my supervisees about, right, is those miniatures are going to draw your attention for various reasons, right? And it's hard to not just collect the things that we have a positive association or attraction to, and especially working with grief and loss, right? Having those things that give us a feeling, regardless of what that feeling is, so that our clients do have that wide selection, because Sandtray work, right, can be, it's incredibly empowering, right? And does so much in thinking about that from a grief and loss perspective, right? And all of the elements that come with that are incredibly important.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with everything you just said.
So, Marisa, if I've never, now, Colleen is a registered play supervisor. I am a licensed mental health counselor. So if I have never heard of a Sandtray, what is it and what are the benefits to my client of doing a Sandtray? You talked about the benefits of doing sand play and all of those emotional regulation and the tactile pieces. What are the benefits of the Sandtray itself?
Sandtray is it's one of my favorite things, honestly. So, I have within Blue Tree, we have a registered art therapist. And the way I like to think of Sandtray is it's a very expressive form of therapy, right? But some clients, including the kids that I work with, get really hung up on their artistic abilities. And some of them just can't move past the fact that they don't think they're good at drawing or that they don't think they're good at painting. They put all of these labels on themselves. And so that becomes like really restrictive then in how you can do some expressive work with them, because you don't want to trigger a client. Like that's not the goal, right? So this allows them to be really expressive in how they are processing their feelings, the events that happen in their lives. And it's really tapping into the right brain. We're healing and we're expressing, and we're not getting hung up on the fact that I can't make this person look like my dad. Like, oh, I'm going to pick this dad figure out and I'm going to stick it in the sand and that will be my dad. End of story. So it allows so much more freedom and flexibility for these kids and adults too. I know plenty of adults who have benefited from Sandtray work, and it's remarkable because we don't even know necessarily what's in us. It just comes out in the tray. And then some of the clients, as they are taking a step back and really looking at what they create, and some of them I do process with, not always, but some of them. And a lot of them will be like, well, I don't even really know why I put that in there. And then upon processing it, they're able to identify, oh, that's why. It's because it reminds me of this situation or this person or this thing that happened. So it's incredibly healing.
Love that. So the benefits that we get from doing expressive artwork, the Sandtray allows us to do so much more depth with that because we can eliminate that need to, does this look right? Does this look good? Does this, we can eliminate all of that. We can also, because it's 3D, we can go down, we can go up, we can move the levels, and we can use the sand in that way. We can use the sand as a piece of it, as a barrier, as a divot. And so I love the comparison of the sand as a canvas to expressive art therapy, an actual canvas, because we just do have so much more. I loved what you said about natural sand pieces, because our family could be made of rocks, and this rock is my dad, and this tree is my mom, and that is, or this tree branch is my mom. And that is such a great way of being able to bypass that part of our brain that says, that's not your mom. That doesn't look like your mom. That doesn't look like your dad. Oh no, I made my baby sister way taller than my mom. Who cares? It doesn't
Exactly.
in the tray. Whereas with art, and because we're being great, we have art classes where we're being graded, right? So we have art teachers that might say like, oh, your scale is off, right? Things like that. So those things are so ingrained into us that it's more difficult to bypass those things when we're doing art on an actual canvas. Whereas when we're doing it in the sand, we're able to, that part of our brain can go, okay, this isn't my problem.
Exactly. Like, this is what's presented. These are the options. And so here I'm picking from these set of options. Yeah, that's a great point. I love that.
Marisa, it makes me think too, right? When we're doing more traditional, like non-directive play therapy, right? Without the use of the Sandtray, a lot of what we're doing when we're building rapport is that tracking element, right? And so it doesn't matter what object the child picks from the playroom. I'm not labeling that, right? I'm not identifying what that is. And the Sandtray allows us, right, to have that space to really mimic that rapport building and that tracking, but in a way, like you talked about, that gives it those parameters, right? And that next step of directive intervention, but then being able to use those pieces, like Julie was saying, to find what I need without worrying about what it may be or my ability to create that. And I think when we're working with grief and loss, right, having that ability to shut off those parts that filter our thoughts, right? And those parts that sort of second guess our abilities is such a critical point. And so as you're using that Sandtray, right, and you're in a place where you've got your miniatures and that wide selection, what are some of the directive interventions that you have found to be really beneficial for your clients?
So this is also assuming that you've done like some groundwork, right? Like you've introduced what Sandtray is. The clients are on board for it, willing to try. So there are some presumptions.
Can you talk about what that is before we get into interventions? Can you talk about one more process for explaining the Sandtray?
So again, I do try. So the way I structure my my play therapy room is a little bit different than other practitioners. I think it's a very personal choice. So I actually have a different collection of miniatures that I use for Sandtray that aren't accessible to all of my kids. So it's very intentional when I actually pull those miniatures out that the intent is to use them for Sandtray. So I will frequently tell my, again, you're doing this probably with older elementary school kids, is the starting age is what I would recommend starting that. But I would introduce it as, your brain is a really amazing tool that you have along with your heart, along with your body. And I have something that we can do that's pretty artistic. And again, I'm playing up the client's strengths. I'm making this very individualized for each one of my kids that I'm using this with. But I want to see what it would be like if you were to use this really special set of toys that I have to kind of create an image in the sand. How would you feel about that? And then just kind of go from there. Again, I would use a lot of my clients' strengths, things I know that they were interested in, maybe a topic that they had been really concerned about that week, to kind of explore further. So it is personalized, and just kind of go from there. Most of my kids are really excited about it. I do have some children who I've worked with that are on the spectrum that it wasn't super successful with. I don't know if the error was on my part in explaining it. I don't know if it was a conceptualization thing, but their Sandtrays were very confusing and kind of disjointed. So I'd be interested in seeing more research around using it with that particular population. And I know Homeyer talks about that a lot in her book, along with like who would be an ideal client to use Sandtray with. So that's one point of caution that I would kind of advise clinicians with, is just know your client, know what their strengths are, and just like get really excited about it. I mean, kids get excited when we're excited, right? And they don't need to necessarily know that this is going to be a super involved and emotional process, right? Because we're walking alongside that with them, and we're able to co-regulate them through those emotions that may or may not come up through that process. But some of the directives that I would give in working with a child or adult who has experienced grief and loss recently, or that's, the overarching goal at that point, is it's important to keep your language really neutral, because just because we are worried about the loss, or just because think that they're sad about the loss, obviously we don't want to make any assumptions about how they are feeling. So really trying to keep those directives very neutral in connotation. So what I have done in the past is tell me about a change that is happening. And then the Sandtray explodes with grief and loss elements, themes, and then we're able to process that afterwards. But the language in itself is very neutral, because again, you don't want to sway their processing of the events or of their feelings either way, because they might be really excited that, mom and dad are getting a divorce because they're maybe going to feel safe. Maybe there is someone who passed away in the family that they're just devastated about, but it was such a distant relative that mom and dad it wasn't even a blip on their radar that they would be affected in this way. So again, not making any assumptions.
Rosa, I love that prompt, right? Something that's changed. And I even saw you kind of, light up when I assume, kind of think about some trays that you've seen in response to that directive. And, I love that you said, it explodes with grief and loss. What are those elements and themes that you notice and you see in those trays that go, yes, there's the grief or the loss?
Yes, absolutely. So I know I've talked about the closing of the school, kind of the entire podcast now, but I really want to take a minute to talk about a kiddo that I worked with. We were going to be ending our therapeutic relationship because he was discharging successfully. But the loss of the therapeutic relationship is a loss. So our last session, we had talked about what he wanted to do, and he had suggested doing a Sandtray. So again, my prompt was very neutral, and I said, okay, I would like you for this last session to do a Sandtray on growth. I know that this is a session on directives for Sandtray, but really, we all know that what's going to come out is going to come out. And so you can say one thing and something else totally happens. But so he took the prompt of growth, and he made a beautiful tray. I often tell my clients to take as much time as you need. You can take the entire session to do this if this is how you feel, or it can be a very quick process, but whatever you need. And he took the duration of the session to make this very elaborate Sandtray. And what he ended up doing was, and this is a common theme in grief and loss, is burying.
Yeah, what an incredible, experience for that client and for you, right? And it sounds like, hey, I gave this prompt, right, of a Sandtray. The intention with that one, right, wasn't even on grief and loss, but as you mentioned, Sandtrays bring out so many thoughts and feelings that we may not even know that we're experiencing. And you noticed in that, right, the act of burying in some of the miniatures that were used that were really symbolic of grief and loss. Are there other acts in the sand, right? I know we talked about the burying piece, other things that you've seen that make your brain go, yes, like this has become a grief tray, whether it was intended to be or not.
Right. The burying, I would say, is probably the most significant. There is definitely Terry Kottman in a training that I attended with her. She has loosely associated, I'll say, that when there is a lot of hide and seek elements, it's a come find me and come attached to me, like they're relationship seeking. And so some of that bearing and finding too is like, okay, how secure is this relationship? It like if the therapist isn't picking up on like, oh, I need to go find this rock because this is what the client wants, then like, are they going to be grieving that relationship loss and that rock stays buried? So burying, I would say, is probably the number one thing. There's also a lot to be said with fences and barriers when it comes to boundaries. So if you see lots of separation, that could be an indicator that is a relationship or a situation to which that individual no longer feels comfortable. So that could be also perceived as a loss. But on the other hand, if there's a bridge or a path that's indicated as such by your client, that could be a road to healing or, a resolution.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I really love how much you shared some of the miniatures that maybe get used most often, right? And I'm thinking if I'm new to the Sandtray world and I'm thinking about my caseload and I know, okay, I've got several clients who have some grief and loss related issues, and I can't go out and build the amazing, miniature walls that we see in some of the pictures online. And I wanted to put together a grief and loss Sandtray starter kit, right? In addition to the rainbows, the flowers, the coffins, some fences and bridges, are there other like things that you're like, yes, you need these in your pocket if you're going to do Sandtray with grief and loss?
The coffin and casket absolutely gets used probably more than any other miniature that I have in my entire collection, honestly. It is a favorite because it's also wooden. So there is like a distinct sound that it makes as it's closing that I really think a lot of my kids enjoy, just that level of input. But I would definitely recommend any new therapist who's interested in exploring Sandtray to pick up a wooden little miniature casket. They sell them online in like what would be considered like a grief pack that comes with like your rainbows, a set of crosses, maybe some headstones would also be good things to look for.
Yeah, and you talked about the difference between that directive play and that indirective play, and it sounds like when you're setting up that Sandtray, you're very indirective. You are just tracking what they are doing, and you're using their language. So if they say this fish goes here and it's a dinosaur, you're like, that fish is right there. So you're being very indirective with that. But then once their tray is complete, it sounds like that's really where that more directive piece comes in. And what kinds of interventions are you using for grief in particular once the tray is complete and you've kind of explored the tray, you've noticed things about the tray with them, you've been curious about different pieces and where they go and all of that, in terms of movement in the tray, what kinds of interventions are you using there for grief in particular? Are you asking permission to move different pieces to see how things feel? Are you asking, or are you curious about what would happen if this thing moved somewhere else? Are you doing any of those in particular to grief? Or does grief really need to be settled?
I'm thinking of my clients who I've processed the grief trays with, and I think they have remained stationary. I cannot remember any that have made adjustments to it after the fact. And I will say it is important, like if a client buries something, you don't clean that up. Like you set the tray to the side and you continue your session. Because I have actually had a client, who again with the coffin there was a young lady who was processing the loss of a parental figure in her life. And she was insistent that I leave the coffin buried and put it back in my closet buried, so she could continue it during the next session. And I honored that. In that case, I don't believe, I think then it was done. It was in the closet. The next session, she didn't choose to revisit that. But I left it available for her to pursue for several weeks, and it never came up. So
how do you differentiate then between those pieces that really feel like they need to be buried and remain buried, and those hiding and seeking types of burying, where it's about the trust in the relationship?
I would say the hiding and seeking definitely comes to light more in the sand play. So again, it's more of a fluid piece. The client wants to see if they can be sneaky enough to trick me. And so then at that point, I'm engaged as a participant. I am in the play. They have engaged me. I'm in the play. I'm part of it. So whereas in Sandtray, I am, an observer. That is my role as an observer. So I am not an active participant.
I really like that differentiation, right? I'm a participant, I'm an observer, giving the client the agency to decide what your role is with their play versus their tray. And I know you mentioned earlier, especially if something is buried, that best practice, especially with a grief and loss tray, is let's leave it buried and put that away after the client leaves, or if able to, right, honor their decision to leave that wherever it may be. It's quite so obvious or so buried, or there isn't a client request. I'm curious what your ending process is for these trays and what that conversation with the client looks like, and kind of what the end of these sessions would look like.
Yeah. So some of my clients can't, if it's a really painful tray and like difficult processing it, some of them cannot get away from that tray fast enough. They want to forget about it. It's done. We're moving on. And in that case, then the play transitions to another part of the playroom, and it is literally put aside. Others want to hang on and process it very extensively and tell me everything I've ever wanted to know about that tray because they're incredibly proud of it. They're in the moment. Just continuing to like feel your client out and let your client lead with what they're comfortable with, offering that co-regulation with them to really kind of highlight any things that they want to talk about or better understand or explore differently. Again, your client may be very surprised by what kind of comes out, and they might need your additional support and understanding why that could be. So when we're first processing the tray, I'll ask if they want to title it. And if they wanted to call it something, what would it be? And then I would further ask why. So why are you calling this growth, or excuse me, why are you calling this respect? Because in the back of my mind, I'm like, that I gave the prompt of growth and now you're calling it respect. Like, why is this happening? And that because they'll go off on a tangent and explain exactly why it is called that. And they will let you know exactly where their mind was as they're creating this. And then, just asking if they have any feelings that were brought out in doing this. If there were anything that they maybe had not realized, any realizations that had come to be. And again, if you're doing this with young kids, a lot of it will be developmental, some of the follow-up that you're asking them based on their level of insight and stuff like that. It would be surprising at times to see how much insight some of these kids have into their daily lives that we don't give them enough credit for.
I think I love that we talked about the introduction of the Sandtray, and we got to talk about the kind of wrapping up of the Sandtray as well, and just how important those bookends are on the process, because it allows that the structure on the front and the back allows for that creativity in the middle, and that kind of, it can be whatever it needs to be in the middle. So wonderful, wonderful information here. We talked about what is a Sandtray, what's the difference between a Sandtray and sand play, where I'm an active participant in sand play. It's more like a movie running, and in Sandtray, as the clinician, I'm an observer, and it's more like a snapshot of the moment. We talked about grief and loss. You gave a really colorful example of something that we wouldn't always think of as grief and loss when a school closes in a community in any community, but especially when it serves as a community center. And you gave some other really great examples of what are other kinds of grief and loss that maybe don't involve the loss of a person, but that are different ways that we're still experiencing that. And then you gave us some great directive ideas, indirective and directive ideas for Sandtray interventions specific to grief. And I think that is so helpful to anybody who is on any side of the spectrum in terms of using Sandtray and understanding Sandtray, how grief comes with its own kinds of interventions. So thank you so much for being here. I think this is such great information. One thing I'm personally going to take with me is your neutral language about grief. So not calling it a loss or a grief or tell me about what happened with grandpa. It is calling it, tell me about change. And I think that's something that I'm personally going to take with me from our conversation as well. So thank you so much, Marisa, for being here. We have really, really enjoyed it. If you are watching this and you're interested in trying out a Sandtray for yourself as a client or art therapy as well, you can go to Blue Tree Counseling at www.bluetreecounseling.org. And Marisa is one of the owners there. There are 4 total owners, including an art therapist there. So reach out to them if you are in the Quad Cities area. And Marisa, thank you so much for being here.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I've really enjoyed my time talking with you ladies.
Wonderful. And thank you everybody for listening. And don't forget that you need a training.
Thank you so much for joining us today on You Need a Training. We encourage you to share this episode with anyone you think may be interested in learning more about mental health techniques and interventions. Also, make sure to follow us on Facebook and Instagram to stay up to date with all upcoming training opportunities. And don't forget to listen to our other podcast, You Need a Counselor, where we talk with individuals around the world about their counseling experiences. Heart & Solutions is proud to provide CE-eligible trainings for our counseling community. This training may be eligible for continuing education credit hours through either the National Board for Certified Counselors, provider number 7376, or the Association of Play Therapy, provider number 21-645. To obtain CE hours for today's training, be sure to follow the steps in the description below.